Buenas tardes. Good evening. I'm the director of the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, the Free Institution of Education. We welcome you to this first session of this seminar series, which will be held over the coming months of February and March, coordinated by Professor Fernando Vallespín. This seminar is an extension of the one held in March 2021 under the title Liberal Democracy, Digital Democracy, Democracy and its Current Transformations, and is also part of the line of work on tolerance and democracy, which the institution is developing in collaboration with Residencia de Estudiantes through research projects, seminars and conferences, with the aim to establish networks with institutions and scientists, especially from Europe and Latin America. As you may already know, the Institución Libre de Enseñanza is a private institution that was created in 1876 by Francisco Giner de los Ríos and other professors who had been removed from their university chairs as a consequence of the defense of freedom of expression. The purpose of the institution was to modernize late 19th century Spain through education, science, and culture. Its modernization project implemented the most advanced pedagogical, scientific, and cultural theories and practices from across the globe. After the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, the Institución Libre de Enseñanza was outlawed by the Francoist government. With the reinstatement of democracy at the end of the 1970s, the institution resumed its activity in order to ensure its intellectual legacy and to update it for present-day society. Values such as tolerance, critical thinking, international cooperation, dialogue, were part of the thought and action of Francisco Giner de los Ríos and his collaborators at the institution, and continue nowadays to inspire our work. We are especially thankful to Fernando Vallespín for his work devising and coordinating this seminar series. We are very glad to have been able to bring together such an accomplished group of experts, whom we also thank for their participation. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Rob Riemen. We hope this will be the beginning of a fruitful relationship with him and with the Nexus Institute. We also thank the Spanish Ministry for Foreign Affairs for the financial support and the Residencia de Estudiantes for his collaboration too. We encourage the audience online to use the chat to raise your comments and the Q&A function if you have questions for the speaker. At the end of each session, we will try to answer as many as possible. We hope to see many of you again in the coming sessions of this series. Thank you very much. Fernando, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you very much, Rob, for accepting the invitation. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. I'll try to make a brief introduction of our guest. Rob Riemen is a Dutch writer and an intellectual, I would say a classic intellectual. Not what nowadays is called a public intellectual, but someone whose ideas are really important and are influential. He's extremely well known, not just for his writings, but because he was the founder of an institute called the Nexus Institute. And from what I read, you together with a friend founded it because you were haunted by some very important questions. Questions like, how come European humanism has vanished to exist as an ideal of civilization? What is the value of art and culture? And everything that has to do with the Enlightenment tradition or the humanist tradition in Europe, of course. So the Nexus Institute has become, throughout the years, I think it was founded in 1993, right? Has become, since then, a platform for informed intellectual debate on pressing contemporary issues. Well, the amount of important people that you have invited is really astonishing. People like Fukuyama, Richard Rorty, Jürgen Habermas, George Steiner, and so on and so forth. So it's really amazing. Of course, you're not just the founder of an amazing institute. You're also are a well-known writer. I'll mention some of your books. Nobility of Spirit, A Forgotten Ideal, which has been translated into Spanish and Catalan, as far as I know. To Fight Against This Age, where you advise about the consequences of, this slow revival of what you call fascism, which is populism as well, right? And this book has been translated into about 20 languages. So we're talking about something important. He also has a book of conversations with different intellectuals or at least relevant people from different continents. It's called The University of Life. As far as I know, it's only in Dutch, right?
And Catalan.
And Catalan, okay. Very good. So it's easier. It will be easier for us to read if it's in Catalan, yeah, really. And now he told me he's about to publish a new book with the title of Becoming Human is an Art for Etude. So we're all anxious to be capable of reading it as soon as possible. So at a moment where we're witnessing a retreat of the liberal values and the values of the Enlightenment, to have you here as our first speaker is really a pleasure and also an honor. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Rob.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Elisa. It's quite, it's really an honor to be invited at an institute like this. To be honest with you, I didn't know it existed. Something like this doesn't exist in the Netherlands, unfortunately, anymore. It's one of the reasons why I founded my Nexus Institute. And I hope it will be as old as this institute. Fernando invited me to give a lecture on the culture of liberty. So let's see where we can get it. Confucius, this Chinese master, wise old man of China, was once asked where he would begin if he had to rule a country. I would improve the language skills, the master answered. And his audience was amazed. That has nothing to do with our question, they said. What's the point in improving the use of language? But the master replied, if the language is wrong, what is said is not what is meant. If what is said is not what is meant, the works do not come about. And if the works do not materialize, then morality and art cannot flourish. If morality and art do not prosper, you will find no justice. And if there is no justice, the nation doesn't know where to go. So do never tolerate any arbitrariness in the words. That's all what it comes down to. Now, truly wise words, and in our Western tradition, Socrates gave the same warning. To be able to understand something, you have to call it by its proper name. That is to say, you have to know what the words you use mean. So concerning the topic of our conversation tonight, the culture of liberty, what does that mean? What is liberty? What is culture? Let's start with liberty. In my quest for its meaning, I came across what is written in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 8, verse 32, the truth will set you free. In Latin of the Vulgate, veritas liberaduit vos, which is of course a quite puzzling expression that makes the quest for the meaning of liberty even more complicated as now we also have to extend our quest also to the meaning of the word truth. And that too is not a simple exercise, because truth, as we use that word nowadays, means nothing else than to know the facts and the figures, data and doing data analysis, and it's the daily work of our academics and experts. But is this truth in any way making us free? Well, yes, it will liberate us from being ignorant concerning correct information, but that cannot possibly be the meaning of the culture of liberty. Although the quest for meaning is now even more complicated, we should not give up. And maybe it was a blessing in disguise that now also we have to find the meaning of the word truth. Anyway, fortunately we can, as always, count on the support of the muses, the poets, as it is their calling to protect, to give us the words and to protect the meaning of words. Now, in the modern age, the one writer who has devoted his life to the meaning of human freedom is Dostoevsky. And Joseph Frank, who used to be a good friend of mine, he died many years ago, the man who wrote in 5 thick volumes the ultimate classic biography of Dostoevsky, informs us about the following. The turning point in Dostoevsky's life is the time he spent in prison because of having been part of a left-wing conspiracy against the Tsarist government. And about his time in prison and how that experience transformed him, he wrote that beautiful semi-autobiographical story, House of the Dead, after he was released from his prison in Siberia. It was still the time that nothing could be published without permission of the local censor. For him, the St. Petersburg Censorship Committee. And then something remarkable happened. When the publisher submitted the 2nd chapter of the book, although Dostoevsky obviously also expressed all the tremendous hardship, pain, hunger in the camp, the censor thought that Dostoevsky still painted a too rosy picture, as he also wrote about how the prisoners could walk freely in camp, sang songs, smoked, played cards at night. The censor, afraid that criminals might think that prison is a kind of paradise, refused to have it published. So the publisher then sent the chapter to the Central Censorship Authority, and while they were studying the text, Dostoevsky, in the meantime, wrote a supplement, which he then did not publish, as that censorship authority overruled and agreed the chapter to be published as it was originally written. Now that supplement was discovered in 1922, and Joe Frank quotes a part of it in his biography, as he rightly argues that it expresses what Dostoevsky has learned in the House of the Dead about the essence of the human spirit. Here is that quote. Dostoevsky. What is bread? They, the prisoners, had bread to live, but they have no life. The genuine, the real, the most important is lacking, and the prisoner knows that he will never have it, or he will have it, if you like it, but when? It's as if the promise is made only as a joke. Try an experiment and build a palace. Fit it out with marble, pictures, gold, bird of paradise, hanging gardens, all sorts of things, and step inside. Well, it may be that you would never like to leave. Perhaps, in actual fact, you would never leave. Everything is there, let well enough alone, but suddenly a trifle. Your castle, with all the gold, is surrounded by walls, and you are told, everything is yours. Enjoy yourself. Only don't take a step outside. And believe me, in that instant, you will wish to quit your paradise and step over the wall. Even more, all this luxury, all this plenitude will only sharpen your suffering. You will always feel insulted as a result of all this luxury. Yes, only one thing is missing, a bit of liberty. A bit of liberty and a bit of freedom. End of quote. Now, given this powerful expression of a deep longing for liberty and freedom in the human spirit, it is almost astonishing what Dostoevsky wrote 20 years later in the last novel he finished writing just before he died, The Brothers Karamazov, within the novel The Famous Legend of the Grand Inquisitor. And I'm sure you all know the story, which takes place around 500 kilometers from here in Seville in the 16th century Catholicism's heyday. There is a religious festival, 100 heretics are going to be burned, and everybody wants to be there. The court, the people, all the church authorities. And then a rumor. A stranger is coming, and he can make the blind see again, and he can make a lame walk again, and bring a girl back from her deathbed. The people hear this and know that he has returned. And the cardinal takes drastic action. That evening, in the prison, the cardinal launches the following tirade. And freely translated, he says, "What kind of moron are you? Why did you return? We, your church, my colleagues and I, have spent ages improving your work. Idiot, you thought people wanted to be free, but that's nonsense. People want to be happy. Freedom makes them unhappy. Then they have to think for themselves, make their own choices, be responsible for good and evil. That's not nice, that's not what they want. And we as the church, we want to help them. How? By providing people with marvels, mystery, authority. Naturally, the people need to be obedient, or better still, believe blindly in us. But they are happy to do that. They are no longer free, but we make them happy. And we don't want you to return and to ruin that. So tomorrow you'll be put on fire as well. That's the story in the legend. So here we have the opposite of what Dostoevsky wrote 20 years earlier. Now, liberty and freedom are no longer what the human spirit longs for, but it is what we human beings are afraid of. And if so, then there is simply no culture of liberty. As the fear of freedom was also the topic of Erich Fromm's famous study on fascism, we do now, and rightly so, relate the fear of freedom, the opposite of a culture of liberty, with any form of authoritarianism. However, it is important to note that there is also an authoritarianism that invades our society, and although not in the form of a political ideology, it still makes the culture of liberty, whatever it may mean exactly, we still do not know, impossible. It's another psychologist, Carl Jung, who demands our attention to it when he writes in an essay in 1956, Gegenwart und Zukunft, Present and Future, the following, I quote: "This is the century of the common man, that is the Lord of the earth, the air and the water, and on his decision hangs the historical fate of the nations. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion, and it is counterbalanced by a reality that is very different. In this reality, man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He's intimidated and endangered by the might of military technology, which is supposed to safeguard his physical existence. His spiritual and moral freedom is threatened with chaotic disorientation." Jung is right about this disorientation, as we still do not know what this culture of liberty is. Because this is the other paradox of our era. We do strive to have that house, that palace full of gold, etc., as Dostoevsky describes it in his unpublished fragment of The House of the Deaf. But he was wrong if he thought that all of us want to give it up, that house. The opposite is true. our freedom, our liberalism, is now called Neo-Liberalism, as if we have upgraded the original idea of liberty, as if we have now liberalism 2.0, or maybe already 10.0, and that may give us the idea, the impression that the culture of liberty, being the opposite of any form of authoritarianism, is to have the freedom to do whatever we want, to indulge in all our desires, to buy what we can buy, to strive for as much money we can buy, and to leave our basic instincts free. But the problem with this idea of liberty is that it is essentially empty, because the urge behind it is endless. It will never be enough. One always wants to have more, much more. The Donald Trumps of this world, right? It's never enough. They always need more. So that's the secret power of our neoliberal capitalist democracy, in which freedom is reduced to license with all its consequences. There is a third idea of freedom, which is also addressed by Dostoevsky, and now in his novel, The Devils. It's a freedom promoted by young revolutionaries, radicals, nihilists they call themselves, as there is nothing they can believe in except freedom, an unlimited freedom. Not to buy something, but to do whatever they want. Yet the paradox is that they know and admit that their idea of unlimited freedom will lead to full dictatorship, as their freedom should lead to unlimited equality. Out of a sense of social justice, there will be no differences anymore. And the novel is rightly considered to be a grim prophecy of the Russian Revolution by Lenin, Stalin and Trotsky. Yet for our quest to what the true meaning of liberty and freedom is, the ideas of one figure in the novel, Kirillov, are important. This Kirillov figure is a kind of atheist philosophical messiah who is deeply convinced that the ultimate proof of absolute freedom is to kill oneself. Why should he kill himself? Well, the answer is, for him, that if there is a God, one should obey to his will. However, as there is no God, it is my will, and to show that I am absolutely free, that there is no truth, no value, just nothing, I do have to kill myself. As Kirillov concludes, this is my new terrible freedom. So what do we know now of freedom and the culture of liberty? That there exists a fear of freedom, and with it an authoritarianism that makes any culture of liberty impossible. That there is a neoliberal capitalist freedom which appeals to our desires and basic instincts for more, 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 whatever we want, yet it is an empty freedom as the focus is only on quantity. And then there is this terrible freedom, the freedom provided by nihilism, which is not only empty as well, but it is also violent. Now it's obvious that neither the neoliberalism nor the nihilism can bring us any meaningful culture of liberty. So where shall wisdom, in this case the meaning of words, be found that will tell us what kind of culture of liberty its essence is? In 1931 and 1932, the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce gave a series of lectures in his hometown Napoli, which were published as a book entitled The History of Europe in the 19th Century. And Croce dedicated the book to Thomas Mann. The two men has never met, but Croce, living under the fascist regime of Mussolini, correctly considered the German novelist as a fellow European and brother in arms fighting for the culture of liberty. Now, be not deceived by the boring title of this book. It is an extremely well-written history of Europe in the 19th century, as the age in which a new religion takes root, the religion of liberty. And that's his expression. And with it, Croce wants to describe the phenomenon how after the Napoleonic Wars all over Europe, there grew a new consciousness, a new demand, a new concept of man based on liberty. Liberty as an idea and an ideal was, according to Croce, I quote, springing up everywhere. It was found on the lips of everyone, appearing in the stanzas of poetry and the words of men of action, no less than in the formulas of those who were philosophers by profession. As I'm in Madrid, you will be interested to know that Croce adds, I quote, there is no little irony in the fact that this new spiritual attitude received its baptismal name from the least likely sponsor, the country that more than any other in Europe had been tied shut against philosophy and modern culture, a country preeminently medieval and scholastic, Spain, which at that time coined the word liberal, together with its exact anonym Serville. I could not check this, but I thought it was very interesting that apparently in your country the whole concept of liberalism was given birth. Anyway, the book, this history of the ideal of liberalism and with a democracy, is the history of a battle. The battle first against theocracy, the absolutism of the Catholic Church and monarchies, but also the confrontation and battle against Russian nihilism, the theme of Dostoevsky's Devils, which for Croce is just an extreme and mad form of the premises posed by European naturalism, in which ideas and ideals and our life is, I quote, enriched with scientific notions and laws, but robbed of its spiritual law, shut out from the knowledge of the meaning and the value of human life. Liberty, Croce, liberty demands ideas and ideals. Naturalism, determinism, and practical materialism are its enemies, just as they are the friends of absolutism and despotism of every kind. End of quote. So the battle continued, but it became an uphill fight, especially in the academic world, the sleepy world of European thought. This is how Croce characterizes an academic world full of specialists, transfixed by the ideas of positivism, evolutionarism, empirism. Liberty became an abstract concept in the academic world. In the political world, people like Mazzini, Garibaldi, and Lincoln, all men who incarnated the culture of liberty, had died and were replaced by those who were not eager to carry the flag of liberty. And what happened next was even worse. Because materialism, naturalism, and positivism are the intellectual expressions of the emptiness of nihilism. And given the fact that what we human beings fear most, all of us, is emptiness, it's the one thing nobody can deal with. I mean, Nietzsche's solution was you have to be ein Übermensch to deal with it, otherwise everybody would commit suicide immediately. That void, that intellectual void, got filled by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century by mysticism, irrationalism, which inspired a new activism which took the form of fascism, Nazism, Marxism, and Leninism. And here Croce points to a very important paradox. Because on the one hand, this activism which took over Europe absolutely hates liberalism. All those totalitarians, they hate liberalism. Yet on the other hand, at the same time, its original impulse was nothing other than the principle of liberty, because that principle is so intrinsic to the modern world that one cannot do without it. And so Marxism and Leninism claim to be a force of liberation, till now, and not for nothing. And Thomas Mann warned in 1940 an American audience, I quote, "If fascism comes to America, it will come in the name of freedom. And the two fascist parties in my country, the Netherlands, are called a party for freedom and the other a forum for democracy. All those fascist, totalitarian, they will always claim that they are a force for liberation. But, and this is a crucial but, if liberty, writes Gracia, if liberty is deprived of its moral soul, if it is detached from the past and from its venerable tradition, if its heroism is deprived of the purity of the end, then nothing remains but action for action's sake. War and slaughter and suffering death are things to be sought for and desired for themselves. This is, as Gracia continues, a parody of an ethical ideal, a substantial perversion of the love of liberty. It is still a religion, but now the celebration of a black mass. Liberty having a moral soul. It is this moral soul that is missing not only in the activism of the 20th century totalitarian movements, again, which present themselves as movements of liberation, but that moral soul is what the Russian nihilists longing for the absolute freedom are against. It is missing in the commercial freedom promoted by Neo-Liberalism, and it is apparently not sought for by those who live in fear of freedom. Therefore, it must be this moral soul, we may call it also truth, not the physical but the metaphysical truth, that reveals the original meaning of liberty and freedom. And it is Goethe who captures this original meaning when he remarks, I quote, "Freedom consists not in refusing to acknowledge anything above us, but in revering something that is above us." And now we can understand the expression, "the truth will set you free." This truth, this moral soul, is what calls upon us to elevate ourselves out of our fears, worst instincts, frustrations, insecurities, passions, blindness, etc., to the values of truth, the dignity of being a human being. And that is what the spirit of liberty is all about. The call to become whom we should be, to make our life meaningful, to answer to the call to live our life in truth, to create beauty, to do justice, to have compassion. And it is this spirit, these liberating forces, that according to Dostoevsky, when he wrote his supplement for his novel The House of the Dead, will motivate anybody to get out of the golden prison, long for at least a bit of liberty, a bit of freedom. However, to be able to do so, to become free, we have to have that culture of liberty in which we can educate ourselves and prepare for the battle of freedom. But what is culture? Fortunately, we do know the original meaning of that proud word culture, as it comes from a famous expression by Cicero in his Tusculan Disputation, where he writes, "Cultura animi philosophia est." The cultivation of the human soul is the quest for freedom. This is what culture is. Culture, in its original meaning, is not an anthropological descriptive concept, as it is so often used nowadays, but it is a moral concept. It is the space where we strive to cultivate our soul through the quest of wisdom. And culture therefore centers around truth, the metaphysical truth in which we can find the image of whom we as human beings should be. The moral values, the spiritual truth we have to make our own to be ein Mensch, Now, this, of course, is a quote from Mozart's Magic Flute, where at the end of the story, the end of the opera, Tamino enters the room with the Freemasons, and one whispers, "Oh, he's a prince." But then he stands corrected when the high priest says, "No, he's more than that. He is ein Mensch. He's a human being. To be a human being is more important than having any fancy title, whether it's king or prince or professor or whatever kind of nonsense titles there are." Socrates knew already that this culture of liberty can only exist when it is sustained by education. If the truth, the moral soul, is the objective of liberty, then education is the key to become who we are. What kind of education? Well, liberal education, of course. Paideia is how Socrates called it. Bildung is the German expression. An indispensable part of paideia, liberal education, is to cultivate the human soul through the love of wisdom, is to know the language of the muses, the arts. Because the knowledge of the heart, all your feelings and emotions, which are so often beyond expression, will find their expression and then open up for understanding and communication through poetry, literature, music, visual arts. And that's why you have the arts for, right? I mean, the world of the muses is there to provide you a language which is the only language which can help you, first of all, to express yourself and to know the others. Liberal education is an education in the humanities that aims at character formation, becoming human, reminding and helping us to be that person whom we should be, so that we can live in truth, that we can create beauty, do justice, give true love, and be compassionate with all our fellow human beings and with planet Earth. It's an education to use reason, not so much to know all facts, but to gain understanding and meaning. It is an education grounded in a humanistic philosophy that can guide us in our quest of life through self-examination and using l'esprit de finesse, which is Pascal's untranslatable expression for a philosophical intuition to detect what has value and what not, what is virtue and what is vice, what is true and what a lie. I mean, this is a very important point. I mean, all the things which are truly important, which have a certain quality, it's beyond definition, it's beyond facts. You have to have an intuition for it, and that you can get through education. The liberal education as the quintessence of a culture of liberty aims to help you to change your life, to have a homecoming to your better self, to make truth and justice a home in this world, and to set you free. The freedom Spinoza had in mind when he wrote in his Ethics, the freedom that will elevate us above our animal nature, redeem us from our worst instincts, ignorance and prejudices, a freedom with which he can develop a critical mind that will protect us against the lies and false promises of demagogues and fundamentalists. However, our culture of liberty is indeed under threat. And the main threat, in my view, is that in the process of 100 years, we have lost gradually the spirit of this liberating education, which is the main reason why we are still confronted with so many enemies of freedom. In a real democracy, the democracy Spinoza fought for, people would be free thanks to a culture of liberty with its liberal education and the cultivation of moral and spiritual values. But that's not the world we live in. Our so-called democracies are de facto mass democracies, or more precise, market economics driven by a technocratic rationalism in which people become more and more like machines, passive, unalive, without much feeling. And society adapts itself to the demands of the market economy by being productive, efficient, useful, conforming to a commercial money culture. I do not know what kind of profession you have, but I dare to bet that 80% of you in your profession are confronted with the fact that you have to be productive, efficient, useful, etc., etc. Education is reduced to being the humble servant of this economy and the mindset of that technocratic rationalism through the promotion of STEM studies: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's it. You know, that's where the money goes to. The art of creation, which is a form of life, has been replaced by the law for innovation, which is the fabrication of that material. And due to the decline of values, because the technocratic rationalism excludes intrinsic values, and also due to the growing social pressures of conformism as the only way to make a career in a utilitarian society. I mean, again, you know, if you want to make a career, you have to adapt yourself to the social pressure of the group. People will become obsessed by serving their self-interest. Quality, which is a spiritual value, is replaced by quantity. Everything is now in numbers. Numbers is the only thing that counts. Therefore, the economists are important because they know everything about numbers and nothing else. It's replaced by, and everything, and even everybody, is reduced to and measured by numbers. And obviously, only the biggest numbers are celebrated because the biggest number is the winner. You have this silly thing of the influencers, right? I mean, this Kelly Jennifer or whatever. I mean, with 290 million followers and 24 billion in her bank account. Now, with this lack of intrinsic values and critical minds, the democracies will decay into our parliamentarism, ruled by a political class, being the perfect mirror of our society. They are full of ambition, greed, short-sighted prejudices, profoundly ignorant, having no vision, and hiding their self-interest with lies and slogans. We can endlessly complain, and I do it all the time, about our political class, but I realize all the time they are like us. This is what Dutch society is nowadays, empty and stupid. Living in this social jungle, where the growing social inequalities, and cultivated ignorance are the breeding ground for resentments, we cannot be surprised about the return of the fascist mindset, with its love for demagogues, the politics of lies, hatred, fear, and xenophobia, the cultivation of nationalism, materialism, authoritarianism, and that is spice of the life of the mind and care for the human soul. So what's to be done? The new masters of the universe, the innovations of artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence, want us to believe that science and technology, that robots and the machine man will bring us to a new civilization. That might be true, but it will be by definition another inhuman civilization, as it will be deprived by all that makes us human, the knowledge of the heart, striving to make eternal values our own in our mortal life, the quest of life for meaning, and make life worth living. Yet the masters of the universe will tell you that even if you don't like to live in their variation of a brave new world, it will come anyway, so you better accept it. But we don't have to accept this, as much as we should accept the return of fascism. We should never forget that one of the essentials of a humane civilization is the power to say no. To say no. No to the lust of killing. To say no to the lust of power and money. To say no to all those instincts and desires that reduce us to animals. To say no to the cultivated stupidity of a commercial culture that reduces us to mindless consumers. To say no to machine age who will turn us or makes us slaves of robots. The other essential of a humane civilization is that we should never forget that the only defense against any form of inhumanity is the culture of liberty. in which we can cultivate our soul and rediscover our common humanity and have a democracy as the only form of government that gives space to a pluralistic society in which everybody, irrespective of their individual identity, can live with dignity and in freedom together. The culture of liberty, like everything of spiritual value, is and will never be a given. Every generation has to create and defend it. The only justification for us intellectuals, and given the fact that you're all here, I consider you intellectuals, is to be the guardians of that culture of liberty. To be the guardian of that culture of liberty. And the best way to defend that culture against all nowadays threats is to expose the many lies of what culture, liberty, of truth supposes to be, to give back the original meaning to the words, and provide our society the only education that will set them free and make their life meaningful again, the liberal education of a culture of liberty. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Rob, now we'll start with the debate. May I start?
Please, yes, it's your...
Yeah, there's so many points I would like to pick. But, you know, because you started by trying to make a definition of liberty and of culture, right? Mm-hmm. So this brings me to a question. You remember the famous book by Thomas Mann, not the Magic Mountain, but these reflections of an unpolitical, Bemerkungen eines Unpolitischen. Yeah. And there he states something which I think somehow has to do with what you've been talking about, which is this implicit difference between culture and civilization, right? Because culture somehow presupposes, and that's why at that time Thomas Mann, was rather skeptical about, the formal liberties of liberalism. Culture somehow presupposes that, civilization somehow presupposes something that's stereotypical, something that's not profound, something that's, frivolous, whereas culture in the German sense, even though it doesn't share the idea of, let's say, Anglo-Saxon liberties, right, was profound, was soul-reaching. As you said, you need, in order to be free, you need a moral foundation, a moral soul. So, and isn't it a little bit dangerous nowadays, to try to define liberty not in terms of liberties, of rights, I would say, and to connect it with things that somehow appertain more to a certain culture, a particular culture. So in the sense that I am free as long as I'm a real Hungarian, would Orban say. That's when I feel free. So I'm not interested in those formal liberties of the West, but I'm interested in what reaches my soul. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yeah, sure.
So, and I think there's a certain danger, because I think what we're discussing right now is precisely this, right? So that our so-called formal freedoms are being trying to be countenanced by, supposed deeper, soul-reaching identities, where we find ourselves realized as, as members of a certain culture. And I think that's maybe to demand too much of everything that's soul-reaching is It's dangerous. I mean,
No, well,
that would be my point.
yeah, no, I got your point, and I respectfully disagree with you. Let me explain. A few remarks. First of all, I consider democracy the most elitist model of government there is. Because it demands so much of everybody. It demands that kind of education I've been talking about for 40 minutes. And Spinoza understood that very well. Going back to my great friend Thomas Mann. Let me put it this way. In 2018, I published my... this book I wrote to fight against this age, in Spanish, Para combatir esta era, on fascism and humanism. The original essay I wrote in 2010, because I saw the fascist movement growing in the Netherlands. It was published in America in 2018. And I think also here in Spain in 2018. Anyway, so there was we had the presentation in America, and my American friends, as they are, very nice, but they could not believe one single word of it. We are the United States of America. We have the Constitution. We have the institutions. We have the Supreme Court. Blah 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 blah. And no, you cannot say that Trump is a fascist because he's not violent. I said, well, then read my book, and not read my lips, just read my book. Because I explain on behalf of, with Karl Kraus, that I said, when it's already in the language, you can wait for it, it will come. I said, but next to that, you make a big mistake. And then I told the following, what relates to your question. I said, Thomas Mann, when he finally came to America to live in exile, which was in February 1938, he was already scheduled to go on a lecture tour, and entitled "The Victory of Democracy." That was the title of the lecture, "The Victory of Democracy." And it's pretty amazing because you speak about a man who is very, very German, whose accent of English is much worse than mine, and it was on town hall meeting, and 2,000 to 3,000 Americans showed up to listen to a lecture for almost 2 hours. Impossible nowadays. Anyway, it happened then. And then, of course, he had to start with, who am I? I'm a German. I come from a Nazi Germany. And you, the Americans of the world of Walt Whitman and Lincoln. And who am I to tell you what democracy is? He said, but you know what? He said, I know something which you cannot know because I grew up. I lived in the city of Mr. Hitler for more than 20 years. I saw this whole fascist movement growing. And I learned something what you Americans should never forget. And that is that the essence of a democracy is not the institutions. The essence of a democracy is the spirit of a democracy. And it's the spirit that can elevate people, etc., 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 because of all our worst instincts as well. And I never forget those lectures because if you see what's happening right now, the institutions in America are falling apart in front of our eyes. Forget the Supreme Court, forget Congress, forget the Republican Party. The institutions, and so that the Democrats are now focused on, yes, of course, they should make it possible that everybody can vote, etc., etc. But that this already can happen relates to the fact that they have no clue what the spirit of democracy is all about. And in a certain way, already de Tocqueville warned them for it. So no, I like to stick to my point that if we want to keep a culture of liberty, it starts with realizing what the spirit of liberty is all about. And that's much more difficult. But much more essential than because then the institutions will follow. But if the institutions are not based on a certain spirit, on a certain sense, what Koch so eloquently explains, then the whole thing will collapse because the fundament is no longer there.
Oh yeah, of course I would agree with you on that. I was just wondering, if because I always tend to get disturbed by the word soul, because
that's
so much used, by populists, so the
but hang on. Listen, look, we're friends, okay? So no worry about that. But listen, and I was not allowed to use the word fascism because it's so often misused. I said there is one word which is more of a misuse than fascism, whatever, which is the word democracy, right? Yeah. I mean, Saddam Hussein claimed to be a democracy. Mubarak, when he was still there, was so proud because he had 101% of the votes. I mean, listen, they always claim. I mean, so. This is why I started to my lecture with, we have to reclaim the original meaning. Next time I can give a talk on the original meaning of soul. There's nothing wrong with the word of soul. And when we deprive us, I mean, according to Socrates, the definition of a human being is that we have a soul. Now, you can take away the soul, but you get into something problematic.
Yeah, I perfectly understand what you mean, and I agree with you. Without liberal education, I mean, there's no democratic spirit, and I think this house where we are has always fought for that.
Yeah,
I mean,
this is the incarnation.
This is a practical example of what you said.
But what makes you? Why are you hesitant with the word soul?
Are you asking me? Mm-hmm. No, because I think it's very much within the rhetoric of neo-populists, right? So,
but those people are stealing everything. That's my whole point. If I talk
to recapture, the original meaning.
Yeah, but the Nazis were very fond of Beethoven and Bruckner and European values and united Europe and whatever. So we have to take it back from them. And the big mistake the left, and I consider myself part of the left, therefore I can criticize them, is that they have given up on these words and left it, to those bullshitters. And so they were only left with a kind of abstract intellectual jargon based on political social values, but again, there is no soul in it. And again, there is and people at a certain moment realize it. There is, so when Bush was elected for the second time in America, George W., somebody wrote this book, What Happened to Kansas? Because everybody could understand that Bush and the Republican Party is not serving the economic interest of so many people who vote for him. And then they discovered, for them it's not about economic, it's about identity issues. And of course it's about identity issues. At the very moment people feel threatened by their identity, you get into trouble. Now, here is if you allow me, because I thought, and otherwise, this whole woke thing, right? The woke culture is, I guess we absolutely agree on that, it's a very problematic thing. And why is it problematic? And that's one of the paradoxes at this time. And again, especially America as being the big mirror of Western world. On the one hand, there is the fascist movement of Mr. Trump. On the other hand, there is this woke culture and its cancel culture, etc., etc., etc. What they do not understand is that, first of all, we have seen this before. We called it Stalinism. And it's based on that's why I also quoted The Devils of Dostoevsky. Because in The Devils of Dostoevsky, it's going back to the world of Rousseau and Robespierre, it's this extreme egalitarianism. And that is what woke culture is all about. It's an extreme form of egalitarianism. And therefore it's a very dangerous thing. It's another threat of the culture of liberty. Mm-hmm. The only interesting thing is it's not new, but we have to explain to them it's not new.
Yeah, I do perfectly understand what you mean. Javier, do we have questions from the audience? Because we have this audience, but we also have an audience online. So we have this schizophrenia,
Me?
No? Over there.
Oh. Yeah, 1 second. Yeah, after, okay.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for this great dialogue. Muchísimas gracias a ambos por este gran diálogo. De momento no hay preguntas por parte de...
Well, we have no questions from the virtual
we don't have so far questions from the digital audience, but in the meantime, I might formulate a question. So in your talk, you gave importance to liberal education as the basis for a culture of liberty. And this liberal education is based on a humanist tradition that grants more space to ethical, moral, and spiritual aspects, which all of them are areas of knowledge that today receive less attention in relation to, vis-a-vis others such as mathematics, economics, you mentioned all of them. However, and taking into account the relationship between climate change and climate change denial and the lack of scientific culture, what importance do you give to this process of learning a scientific culture in the liberal education of the 21st century?
Okay, well, this is very interesting. Look, you have to make the distinction between realizing what the problem is and then how to deal with it. In my view, if people are no longer, I mean, it should not be that difficult. I mean, so we live in a highly utilitarian society. Everything has to be useful. Okay, in 1975, the Club of Rome made a report and said everything was now on the political agenda. But they said it in 1975. We did not listen to them because it was not useful. Who cares? You know, it's not our problem. Now, 50 years later, it's everybody's problem. And in 10 years from now, well, I guess you all have seen probably Don't Look Up, which I think is a great movie, but we're heading to the... So you have to have a sense of value, you have to have a sense of what makes life worthwhile living, you have to have a sense of ethics to realize that you also have to take care for planet Earth. Now, that's the first step. And then, look, if we would already have listened to the Club of Rome in 1975, we would not have been in this problematic situation. Now, you know, we are hoping for science. Not that long ago, I was at a dinner of somebody from the financial world who said farewell. And there was a lecture by Martin Wolf. Martin Wolf, the columnist for the Financial Times, a great economist, and had a very bleak perception of what was going on. First of all, he predicted there will be a Cold War with China. The second thing, he, oh yes, something with immigration, how problematic that will be. And he also said to the audience, he said, you know, whatever the Europeans will do related to climate change, it will be wonderful, but it will not make any difference if you see what can happen with the rest of the world. I mean, do it, but don't think you will make a big difference. So everybody was a little bit depressed after his talk by Wolf. And then the people around my table, and again, we were all coming from the world of the banks, then said to me, yeah, but science and technology will save us. You see, that's, but how stupid can you be? There's you know, it's the new faith that science and technology can save us. Yeah, well, you know, science and technology can do also the most horrible things. So first comes ethics. First comes morality. First comes an understanding what really matters, yes or no, which goes far beyond what is useful, yes or no. And if we have this change of paradigm again, first of all, we can get rid of the economists who are now ruling everything because they are in charge of the numbers. Benedetto Croce, this book, The History of Europe in the 19th Century, I can everybody recommend to read it. He ends with an epilogue. And in the epilogue, he says something which is so relevant still today. He said, nowadays, beginning of the 30s, we Italians should remember that it's only 70 years ago that the people from Napoli and Rome and Torino came together and created a united Italy. Not because they were against the identity of Napoli, Rome or Torino, but they could fuse into a larger identity. And he said, and the same can happen with Europe. The same can happen with Europe. Germany, Italy, France, the small countries, we can come together and create a united Europe. Not because we are against our own national identity, but we can be part of a larger identity. And he said, but of course the big threat is the rise of nationalism. This psychological force which wants to reduce us to small... Okay, he said, but we can stop that. He was very optimistic. He can stop that. He said, but first of all, we have to have a different class of politicians. We need a different class of politicians. He said, but the class of politicians, now they will not be able to deal with it. He said, but even if we have this statesman, this is the first, okay? Now we can speak about the stateswoman or whatever. He said, but if we have this person, you know, he can rise above party politics and try to do the right things. There is nothing that person can do if we don't have a different class of intellectuals. Because we have to get rid of the academics, and we have to have intellectuals who can prepare the moral grounds to do this. And you know much better than I do, I mean, how disastrous the situation of our universities are, which are the humble servant of the economy. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree on that. Absolutely. Yeah, esa señora. Yeah. Un segundo. Why don't you take the translate probably in Spanish?
Vale. Thank you very much for your lecture. And I wanted to say something very short. I imagine that you are worried about the problems in the United States, as you mentioned, with Republicans and everything, and democracy. And we have been looking to democracy, mainly United States, with hope, I should say. And now we don't recognize that USA that we lived. And you know what I figure out? And I am really worried because I have my sons there. Is the problem that I find over here too. Here in the schools, they say that they are teaching our kids, you know, good values and attitudes and all that. But they forget that attitudes cannot be taught, cannot be taught. You learn attitudes by model. You modelize them. You see them and you interiorize them. So they are trying to pass a good attitude, a positive attitude, a democratic attitude, but that cannot be taught. So you have to implement that in the school. And that is what was the Institución Libre de Enseñanza. What they learned in the institución was attitudes. I mean, they were to be respectful, to try to understand the other people, to respect their ideas and values. So that's why in the institución you had to learn languages. And then we go back to the first part of your lecture. The language is the basic, if you really don't understand what you are talking about. And that's why Francisco Giner, Agosio, and everybody wanted their pupils to learn the languages, because you cannot read in another language than the author. So all the peoples that went in the Residencia and they went to la Junta de Estudios, they had to know the languages. Otherwise, what were you going to do in Germany? And that is the problem that we have now in the schools. I think, and it's my small view of things after so many years, every year, that the problem is that we don't get in the schools, and that is the problem. The problem is in education, as you very well said. The problem is that education is not standing on attitudes, on showing the people what is respect, what the other things they should be respectful, and that is democracy. It's not an institution, as you said, and that's the problem. The problem is that in the United States, in the schools, they don't respect the attitudes, and that is what is becoming now.
Well,
that's the problem.
Well, I'm very moved by what you say. Well, first of all, nobody less than Aristotle already explains that you learn most by example. You're absolutely right. The most important things in life you learn through example, always. And there is this beautiful story by Albert Camus, when he got informed that he got the Nobel Prize. And he writes a letter to his teacher at primary school, so from 6 to 12. And in the letter to that man, he writes, he said, when I got the news that I got the Nobel Prize, moi, Albert Camus, the first thought was about my mother, and the second thought was about you. Because if you would not have been the teacher when I was so young, I never could have become the person I am now. Because you inspired me. You gave me the trust. Because Albert Camus came from a very poor family. His father had died. He had no perspectives at all at that time. And yet it was this teacher who put him on the right track and fought for him and did it. Now, here is the thing. I'm absolutely positive that there are still many of those teachers. But they are not given the opportunity anymore. In the world I know best, the world of the universities, it's ruled by, again, numbers, bureaucracy. I mean, the classes are too big, there is no timer anymore, etc., etc., etc. And what I find difficult to understand is that, look, there are many things which are very complicated, in the political world, etc., etc., etc. But we, in the West, are so privileged that we do have the financial resources to get our education right. It's not that difficult. We are not facing the horror they are facing in Syria. We are not facing hunger, or we are not facing huge poverty. We do have those, and we don't do it. Now, Nietzsche, when he was young, relatively young, but he became professor when he was 23 or something like that, very young. And the local student organization were impressed by, this man with the big mustache, and he was already professor. And they asked us, well, Professor Nietzsche, can you give us a lecture? And Nietzsche said, well, so what kind of topic? He said, well, why don't you speak about the future of education? And Nietzsche said, okay, I'll write some lectures on the future of education. And so when you read those lectures, he gave them in 1874, right? So around the time this institute started. And in his lecture with Mr. and Mrs. Wagner on the first row and Jacob Burckhardt, and he tells a story, as he likes to do. And the story he tells is that young students come across an old man, and this old man tells them, you students, I pity you. I pity you. Because the days of the school of civilization are over. Our society is no longer interested in civilization. Our higher education will be completely focused on what's good for the state and what's good for the economy. And the worst part of it is, you'll be fine with it because you're only interested in money and, if possible, making much money as possible. And of course, you still have a little bit of culture because it would be embarrassing not to know who Mozart and Beethoven were, but not enough, but not too much, because otherwise you're wasting your time. Now, again, this was 150 years ago. It was all predicted, all lined out. This is, and in general, I cannot, you know, I cannot generalize, but the education system, definitely in America, my country, which I know best, it's a complete disaster. Complete disaster, because it's indeed based on, you know, what's good for the economy, good for the state. I was fortunate, you know, I could study for 10 years. Nowadays, students are happy if they can study for 4 years, and they come away with nothing. So yes, so this is, again, it has again to do with the spirit of our time. The spirit of our time is that we are so focused and interested in everything except the culture of liberty, because we do not understand what the culture of liberty is all about. That's the whole fucking point. We do not know anymore what it is. Anyway.
Thank you, Javier. Other questions? Maybe the audience? No? Okay.
Yes, there are a couple of questions from the audience in Zoom. There's a very brief one which asks if you could develop a little bit what you mean by human soul. Mm-hmm. And the other one is more complex, more for debate. And Carmen asks, Smilansky says that in order to keep our moral and personal world intact, we need some illusions, like that of being free, or that of having been free, fully free, at some point in the past. I guess that what Carmen is trying to ask is if we are idealizing some sort of lost golden era in which, so to say, this culture of liberty reigned large. If what we are doing is idealizing this golden era of a culture of liberty.
Can you repeat the second question? I understood the first question, but the second question, what?
Yes, so what Carmen asked is, Smilansky says that in order to keep our moral and personal world intact, we need some illusions, like that of being free. And in that sense, if we are idealizing a golden era of liberty that existed in the past but doesn't exist anymore.
No, well, okay. Well, first of the first question. If you want to know what the human soul is all about, go and look at the dead body. It's simple. At the very moment you have seen a dead body, you know what the human soul is. And you know what it means if there is no soul in the body anymore. This is as brief as I can be. Illusions or gold. No, and the point I wanted to make is that, as I said, you know, all things. Well, first of all things that are really important in life are the useless things. I mean, I hope that if you have a relationship, it's not because you think X or Y is useful to you, because then the love is out of it. And if you happen to have children, I hope you don't have children because they are useful to you, because then something goes deeply wrong. The things that really matter in life are always what's useless. Trying to understand life, trying to give meaning to life, to be a friend. You know, is there use in being injustice? No, it's not useful. It's about being human. Now, but here is the thing. None of these things were ever there, you know, as if it was in a rock. It's always what everybody in every generation have to fight for. And probably, you know, we have to remind people. I'm quite positive that if you speak with people one generation older than I am, I'm 60, so people in their 80s. And if you talk about nowadays political situation, they will tell you, as my mother always did, you know, people should know what war is all about. And if they would know war, then they would, you know, understand much better the meaning of freedom, the meaning of being able to eat, not having hunger, etc., etc., etc. And sometimes it works. So then the next step is from in that respect there should be war because the thing is there should not be war. We cannot afford having a war. And liberal education should be there, and a knowledge of history should be there to remind people of quintessential things, to understand what the meaning is. And so we do not need illusions. Do you need an illusion to be free? Do you need an illusion to have love? Do you need an illusion to be a friend? I mean, that's nonsense in my experience. But we also know that these things are not simple. Just as you have to take care for, the health of your own body, you also have to take care for, your mind and for who you are and deal with all the complexities of human nature. And because part of human nature are our own insecurities and our own fears and our own frustrations and our bad habits and our whatever things. And, Freud will explain more about it. And it's not, it's a pretty dark picture of what we are as human beings. But we also know the other side. We know that we are capable of, using the human spirit. I mean, this was also part of this great lecture by Thomas Mann, The Victory of Human Democracy. He said, well, we know about the dark part of our nature, but we also know about the human spirit. And because of the human spirit, we know about truth. We know about freedom. We know about friendship. We know about that. That's not part of our animal. That's part of our spiritual nature. So let's cultivate our spiritual nature.
Yeah, and we also had the experience of recently, because of the pandemic, of losing the freedom of walking, of moving, right? So in that sense, you realize, my God, when if you lose that, exactly, yeah. No, I think that was quite an interesting experience, by the way. We have time for one more question. You want to put it?
Well, I want to ask you, don't you think that nowadays freedom, liberty are not trendy topics? There are other topics like nationalism, feminism, ecology, even revolution, that are more popular, that dominate the conversation, and perhaps that is a symptom or the cause that things are not going very well nowadays. Thanks.
Well, I guess that this is the reason why the genius behind the series of lectures, Fernando, is scheduled to have these discussions on the culture of liberty. And as I ended my lecture, again, look, in the intellectual world, we are very privileged, right? Because, we stand up, we go to our desk, we start reading books, we prepare a lecture, we give a class, we write a book, and it's a very luxurious way of life. Definitely where you get something paid for it. So what's the justification? What is the justification of the life we are living? And the only justification I think about is, a high commitment to truth. Not claiming to know the truth, but the eternal question of what is truth. And it starts with, again and again, exposing the lies. It is not for nothing that the fascist parties, who are experts in the politics of lies, always use our words. They always claim that to be for freedom. They always claim that to be for democracy. They always claim that they are there for the people. If you listen, and they are the most greatest experts in lies ever. And the biggest liar now is living in Florida. But it's working, because there is a thing called demagogues. And the demagogues, we can go back to the time of Aristophanes, they know how to misuse words. And so we have to educate people, not in a very abstract way, but like the mother or like the teacher of Camus, just explaining very simple things in terms of what makes life valuable. And it's that we now live in a time in which so many young people are addicted to games, that suffering from burnouts, that they do not know what to do, that they feel lost in our time, and that they feel let down by the educational system. But there is nothing they can go to. I mean, at our time, when we were younger, we could go to any bookshop, and we, you know, if we had the money, we could buy a wonderful new book by X, Y, Z, and now it's even more difficult, because on Amazon there's nothing you can find if you do not know what to look for. So again, there is a huge moral obligation, at least for everybody of my generation, to make sure that the younger generation at least is given the tools, you know, to do the right things. And we have to explain then to them it goes beyond activism, because activism is important, but if there is no set of ideas and no set of values behind it, they will get lost.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much for attendance of this marvelous lecture, and we hope to see you next Monday again. Thanks a lot.
Monday.
Thanks a lot.